Today on the Wrestling Roundtable, the 10th anniversaries of WCW and ECW's deaths, and rebooking the invasion. Welcome to the Wrestling Roundtable. I'm the host, Eric Santamaria. I've been working in wrestling over 6 years, but I've been a fan of 22 years, just like the man sitting to my left, which is your right, Rodney LeConte. Check out RodneyLeConteFilms.com to see all the latest projects from Rodney LeConte. Sitting to my right, which is your left, first, Orlando O'Neal, fan of 19 years. Alex Payne, who is the current NWA Force One Tag Team Champion. Also been a fan of wrestling 23 years, and last week we talked about the invasion angle that WWF did with WCW/ECW. Well, the reason they were able to do that is because WCW was sold in early 2001 and ECW went bankrupt. So the bottom two and the top three defunct, extinct. WWF now owned practically all of wrestling, and of course other promotions would crop up, but people always look back on WCW and ECW for setting the template. Last time we taped was the day after the last Nitro, and we want to talk about the 10th anniversary now, looking back 10 years later of WCW folding. Last time we talked about what WWF did with WCW, but let's talk about what WCW did to WCW. What led up to this? What was the reason why AOL Time Warner wanted to get rid of WCW, Orlando?
Contracts. And I'm not talking about money contracts. I'm talking about the creative control that the wrestlers had in their contracts. I think that's what led to WCW downfall.
In what sense?
For example, Hogan could choose however he wanted to end his match. Certain wrestlers had winning the WCW title into their contracts. Now, when you're trying to book an event, all these things can come into play, which can kind of mess up the flow of the event. Everybody having these fat creative control contracts is what led to their demise.
I don't know necessarily. Obviously, there were some instances where you could see a creative control clause contradicting what would have made sense and causing some trouble, but was that really a factor in a lot of the bigger mishaps in WCW?
In my contract that I'm supposed to become the WCW World Champion, when you're kind of going down a flow and you're trying to build up somebody, and then, guess what? I'm throwing in my creative control clause and I'm taking the title off of Goldberg, or I'm taking the belt off this guy, or I'm telling him to take the belt off that guy. It kind of does hamper with things, and if you're building towards something that could mean something where you can make some money off it eventually, doesn't it kind of screw everything up for you in general for your company?
Well, that's more of a creative sense than really. Creative control clauses may have had a part in that, but obviously WCW in general usually was not historically known, even before the Monday Night Wars, of having a real vision and following through with it. It was always a company that was notorious for power structures in the Turner organization, and even before they were bought by Ted Turner, Jim Crockett was running it into the ground with Dusty Rhodes. So it does seem like egos get in the way, but is that part of the problem, the bad booking that causes a lot of this? Or a lot of people, speaking of contracts, think that it was because there were so many people with these huge money contracts, Bischoff handing off $500,000 or whatever to Rick Steiner and Stevie Ray or his hunting buddies or whatever it is.
Lanny Poffo, Randy Savage's brother, was getting paid by WCW, and I don't think we've ever seen him on WCW television.
Problem was that they were still doing all those contractual huge payouts when they were making money, when they were doing good. So it probably isn't necessarily the problem it became later on when they were losing money. So what do you think it was, Rodney? Was it creative? Was it contracts? Booking?
I think it was a little bit of everything, on top of the fact that all the executives at Turner never wanted wrestling on their programming in the first place. So when WCW, I guess, failed to keep up with WWF when they were changing the way they did business, once WCW kind of started going downhill, it kind of gave all those executives a little incentive to say, hey, this isn't working for us. Even when Nitro was hot and killing WWF, they were never really on board with wrestling on their programming. So I think really that was one of the things that really led to...
So I think they led to the success they were making at the time. You're beating Vince and you're still pulling all these high ratings. You're still making some
I mean, they warmed up to it, but they were never 100%
No,
behind
they
it.
were never like truly.
They warmed
this is
up
our-
to it slightly.
None of these became a real factor until they really started losing money, like in 2000 when they lost $62 million in 1 year on a $185 million budget. Now, it's probably not a coincidence that around this time, January 2001, the AOL merger was just happening, it was being finalized, and they looked at the books and like, what the hell's going on with this shit? Let's get rid of it. Now, Eric Bischoff and Fusion Media Ventures, which were his backers, were in negotiations to buy WCW. They had so much confidence in it that they even announced that they had bought it when they hadn't. Now, we know what happened a couple weeks later with Jamie Kellner, who was appointed chairman and CEO of Turner Broadcasting. He just said, no more wrestling. It's doing good ratings, yeah, whatever. It doesn't fit our demographic. It doesn't attract the right advertisers. But I'm going to throw this out there. It may be a little diversion into conspiracy theory, but I am a conspiracy theorist. And when I came across this, it wasn't something I had heard, so I don't think it's out there. And I'm going to throw it out there just to see what you guys think of it. This was from JP, who wrote the Hamilton Avenue Journal on 411 Mania, which was an article I really enjoyed. And he seemed like he had some sources on this, but he touched on something I'd never heard of. I asked him to go into detail about it a little more, and this is what he said. In January 2001, Eric Bischoff was in negotiations with Hulk Hogan to buy WCW, and Fox and NBC began to negotiate with Fusion Media Ventures for the rights to WCW programming. By February 26, however, Bischoff and Fusion were locked out of meetings. In mid-March, Jamie Kellner canceled Nitro and Thunder, two of the top-rated shows on Turner Broadcasting, still, even in their downturn, because they did not attract the right kind of advertisers. We all know that story. Kellner, however, was appointed by Turner executive Brad Siegel, and both had a close relationship with Stuart Snyder, who was then WWF's president/chief operating officer. So he had a direct line with people who were in control of WCW's fate. How that connects together is Fusion walked away when it was canceled, when Jamie Kellner said no more wrestling. Fusion backed out, they said it's no good anymore. And even with that in mind, his backers just leaving, Eric Bischoff still went back to NBC and Fox to try and negotiate maybe we can buy WCW, but by that point, Brad Siegel announced that they had sold WCW to the WWF. Now, in the Death of WCW book, Brian Alvarez has a completely different take on that. He says Fusion initially offered $64 million for WCW, then they took a look at the books, offered $48.7 million instead, and then after TV was canceled, they took the offer off the table altogether, and the reason they sold to Vince McMahon so cheap was because there were no more buyers. Now, does that jive together? Do you think that maybe that the head of Turner Broadcasting maybe negotiated a deal with the WWF president at the time to maybe sell WCW so cheaply? Why would they back away from tens of millions of dollars instead of just $4?
From what it sounds like, Vince McMahon already had his ends with Turner. Vince McMahon's a man who always gets what he wants, and as you said, they already did away with television, so that took away some buyers from buying WCW. So Vince McMahon already knew he had his ends. If he could purchase WCW, he could take their library, that's money right there, and it kind of is a conspiracy because who'd have thought Vince McMahon would be the one buying WCW, and Eric Bischoff had the chance to buy it and do something creative with it.
Was it just as simple as canceling TV ruined the whole thing?
Yeah, because without TV, I mean, what do you have? You can't basically...
You have a library of decades worth of video.
Yeah, but I mean, if for WWF's sake, yeah, that would be great.
Oh, I'm not even talking WWF. I'm just talking like if Fusion and Bischoff had got it, yeah, they lost TV, but they still had options. Bischoff had connections in the industry. They were still one of the top-rated shows on their cable networks, and they had decades worth of video library.
History alone says, yes, they have the history of high ratings. They still have a product that if you put it on television, it's already a company that has a built-in audience. So if they were to take the WCW name and put it on a different channel and they just promote it right, it could attract those people with that given. But now that they're being shut out, like you said, Bischoff and Hogan were shut off of all these meetings. There's obviously something fishy going on. When you're being cut off from a negotiation such as that, and you're offering millions of dollars to an organization, and they already got, was it 20 million here or 48 million there, and you're basically taking a really low buyout of what, $3 to $4 million. Something obviously is up. Vince probably had his hooks there, and he had someone fishing around, and they basically baited him the contract.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that he didn't know about it once he found out that there was a chance that WCW was going to sell, because any smart business person would know that it'll be best to buy your competition instead of letting somebody else buy it and trying to compete against you or anything like that. The connections with WWF and WCW seems a little more likely. They're shutting off Eric Bischoff, trying to string him along and say, hey, you know what, you could buy it, and then like trying to lock him out. It just seems more likely that Vince McMahon had his hand in it a little early, and he was quick to buy his competition. Not only just to own WCW, to make his life a little easier.
I just don't think it jives together in the sense that if AOL was worried about this entity losing so much money in their branches, why would they sell it for less? Maybe cancel TV after the fact, I don't know. But then again, AOL, Time Warner lost billions of dollars in and of itself, so maybe it was just a bigger picture of WCW's problems. But back off the conspiracy stuff, you hear often that Vince McMahon is so regretful and, oh, what did I do? What have I done? No one can learn now. There's no more territories. I've killed the competition where blah, blah, blah. But do you really think he feels that?
Hell no. He knows that WCW is trying to kill him. Eric Bischoff stated plenty of times on Nitro, Vince McMahon's going down. When they were going down the ramps, Hogan took the fan signs, WCW beating Vince McMahon. He knew exactly what he was doing. He saw WCW, like we talked about the invasion angle, basically squash all their stars, establish his stars. I don't think he ever saw the dollar signs with WCW, the brand, the wrestlers. But again, he had the library. He had something that he could build off of, which is now today we have WWE On Demand 24/7, whatever you want to call it, which all of us pretty much watch to remember the fun times of wrestling, but it all goes back to Vince McMahon because he owns everything now.
He's not regretful at the time, I don't think. I think I've conquered my base adversary, I've beaten him down, I've bludgeoned him, I bought him out. But I think there is deep down this warm sense of feeling like our company was kind of thriving, we had to be creative, we had to be something more, like we had to come up with new ideas that would hopefully go head to head with the competition.
But if he really felt
If he felt like that, it might have lasted maybe 2 minutes.
Yeah.
No more than
if he really felt that, then why historically have we seen just this pattern of behavior? It's just a piece of it. A, he killed the territories. He would take the top stars in the 80s, block everybody out. There was that pay-per-view war with Jim Crockett. Every time they would do a major show, we got to put on a major show with it. Pissed off all the pay-per-view companies. Now he buys WCW and then ECW. But even after that, every time TNA would seem to do something, like they would do something where, let's just keep Charlie Haas on the bench because they might want to do Team Angle with him. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were just little things they would, at this point, the TNA is so far gone, they just don't even care anymore. But it just seems like they never seem to foster the environment where people might come up to challenge them. So I don't believe he really felt that.
I don't believe so either. I mean, as soon as he had the dream of WrestleMania, I think he had the idea that he really wanted to run the wrestling monopoly. I think he has maybe some remorse, maybe knowing what his father would have said, because his father promised all these guys that he would not compete against him, and Vince McMahon did the complete opposite. But as far as business, as far as the people around him, I don't think he has any regrets. Right now, he's the main show. Like you said, TNA is so far down the competition line where he's not even worried about it. I mean, as fans, we know that the lack of territories has watered down the wrestlers, and everyone's coming up basically the same way. And we might not ever see those Monday Night Wars ever again, but all in all, Vince McMahon did what he had to do, and he was just a smart businessman.
Another reason I don't believe it when he says, oh, no one knows how to work now, and there's no more territories for people to learn. Well, when they sign these people, they put them in developmental to teach them their way to do it anyway, so what difference does it make?
Yeah.
Right.
Now, before we wrap up, one last question about WCW, because if you had said to us in 1997, 1998 that not alone one day, in a couple years, there would be no more WCW, that's like an epic disaster. How do you go from a company making a profit of millions of dollars and a couple years later losing 62 million? Something catastrophic would have had to happen, and maybe in their case it was many catastrophic things. But what do you get out of it? What's the legacy of WCW? What do you take out of it?
Great wrestling. When I think of WCW, I think of it pre-Hogan era. I think of Sting, Flair, NWA, the Wyndham, Luger. And even when Hogan came, the NWO, the Monday Night Wars era, you had the great mid-card guys, Guerrero, Jericho, Booker T, and you had all these new young stars trying to come up. But, like I said, what I think killed them, all the older stars kept holding them down, so we saw the WCW guys starting to jump ship to WWF, and bam, that's it.
There's so much history built up for it. And we all know as wrestling fans, WCW basically was like an old man's game, but after a while it turned into, we have these cool cruiserweight wrestling, we have all these classic wrestling, we have all this, we have great angles. And then when it came right down to it, when we want to see our culmination, when we talk about the invasion, ultimately that legacy basically got spat on. And we all know what was a bit greater than what it was or what it got portrayed as. And unfortunately, the names like Sting and the Flayers, and then we got the Mysterios and the Hogans and all those other things you want to throw in there in the matches. When it came right down to it, we all know WCW had a legacy, and unfortunately, for a lot of people that never got to enjoy it like we did, it got pretty much spat on in the end by a guy like this man.
I also think of WCW as the one great alternative to WWF. It was a great mix of tradition and innovation, very creative with a lot of other things. My peak was the NWO era, because it was something that I never saw before. It basically shit on whatever WWF was doing at the time. It really caused WWF to change. I think it was a true spark of the Attitude Era. They just really failed to evolve when their time came. They didn't really push as much as they could have. Maybe had to do a lot of creative control. They had too many big dogs in the small yard. One time they just tried to be Raw. They really built themselves on being different, and then there came a time where they started to look like Raw and trying to model themselves after Raw, and I think that's where the problem became. And they really thought that, even bringing guys, writers or whatever from Raw was going to help them, when in fact what helped them was being different.
And decline popularity.
WCW Monday Nitro from between, let's say, 96 and 98, early 98, I think was the best wrestling show I'd ever seen. However, what I get out of WCW's legacy and what happened to WCW is, A, never say never. Because we all thought with the Turner money and the size of WCW, people say that about that WWF now. Like, WWF will always be there. You never know that. Let's look at what happened with WCW. Maybe a different situation, but never say never. And the other thing is, wrestling will never learn from its own mistakes. Not just people who observe it, but the people who are actually involved in it, doing it right now in TNA. But we're going to move on to the 10th anniversary of ECW when we come back.
He's got that power builder build.
He really does.
Really does. Sharpshooter, shades of Brett. Look at that.
Textbook
Now, you know what? I tell you what. You watched Brett, you watched Owen. They both had different versions. Jeff is no different.
Taking the belt home with me and going to be on my smooth belly, CM Punk. Cause that belt right here going to be on my smooth belly. Then you going to go home crying like a little 2-year-old. To my mama, I want my belt back. I got beat by this newcomer named Freight Train. I got beat by him. I want my belt back. Tell me what to do.
Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Joining the panel to my left, which is your right, Midge, my broadcast partner at Pro Wrestling Respect, fan of 24 years, and also a fan of 24 years to my right, which is your left, Jay Leto. Will Brooks, who is in our chat room at WrestlingRoundtable.com every Monday night during Raw, fan of 25 years. And speaking of WrestlingRoundtable.com, we're going to talk about the 10th anniversary of ECW's bankruptcy, which happened on April 5th, 2001. HHG, the parent company, filed for bankruptcy, but I think we all pretty much knew it was over when Paul Heyman showed up on Raw on March 5th. It was just a matter of time. But you can read a great book about ECW's history, including its bankruptcy, in Hardcore History by Scott E. Williams, which you can get at our Amazon store. It doesn't have to be MMA or pro wrestling. If it's anything on Amazon, get it through our Amazon store. And while you're at WrestlingRoundtable.com, get the links to all our social networking sites, Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, Go Fight Live, and much more. WrestlingRoundtable.com. Now, ECW had a big fan following, a big cult hit, so to speak. And a lot of people are thinking, well, we were doing good. Paul Heyman goes so far as on the Rise and Fall of ECW DVD to claim that we were really number 2. I think that's real exaggeration. However, it did have a following. But if it had such a following, and I was at the last pay-per-view in the Hammerstein, there were lots of people there. If they were doing so well with attendance, pay-per-views, whatever, why'd it go bankrupt?
It was just bad business overall. Paul Heyman was not a businessman. He should have had businessmen running the company. He should have been taking care of the booking, the talent. But the fact of the matter is, when you have a big sum of money, and you have these guys that WCW and WWF are just plucking from you year after year after year, and you need to spend money to keep these guys around, it's just not going to work. There's no way it's going to work. Too much money, went out the window for certain talents, and it was just bad planning overall. And that's what really did it. The TNN deal was terrible. You have to get on a network that actually embraces wrestling and with the ECW product.
Well, they were really. They were using ECW as a guinea pig.
Exactly, and they didn't know that. And if they would have gotten on a different network, maybe it could have been different, because that is what was keeping them afloat for a long time.
Well, the former Nashville network, which was what TNN originally was before the national network, was really using ECW, like I said, as a guinea pig, and they wanted to use wrestling as their springboard into a more mainstream audience. Went from Nashville network to national network, and they really rebranded themselves around that. Of course, after the year with ECW, WWF shows up, and now we are with TNA. But Jay was mentioning contracts. That was part of it for sure, but also getting the production upgrades for TV, lots of money. They even owed a claim in the bankruptcy court, we found out, like $1.5 million for the video game. Paul Heyman was notorious for not paying a lot of people, but what people don't realize is that it takes a lot of money to run a wrestling show, even Pro Wrestling Respect.
So support it.
Exactly, support it. So go to WrestlingRoundtable.com, pick up the DVDs. But point being, people really don't have a concept of what it's like. When Ring of Honor lost HDNet, people were like, well, why don't they just go on Versus and Comcast? Like, it's that easy. If it was that easy, everybody would do it. So all these things together, all the money being lost by Paul Heyman, was that really what did it? Because was their audience not big enough? The income wasn't there?
It was kind of a niche audience.
Right.
We love it, and I still love it to this day. But yes, the audience was kind of a little too niche. It wasn't brought out for a lot of people to enjoy.
Well, even through their whole history, when they did real well, let's say 97, 98, they were getting pay-per-view for the first time, national exposure. In ECW's whole tenure, they lost $5.7 million, most of it from Heyman's own family's money. Now, of course, it's not the disaster that WCW was, we just talked about in the last segment, or $62 million or whatever, but still, they weren't making a lot of money even when they were at their best. So, was it a lot of these production problems, or Heyman spending the money, or was it all those raids and plucking from WWF and WCW? Was the star power not there at the end?
It was. It was the well went dry. Every time WCW or WWF went in, took some water. They took Taz. They took Mike Awesome at his prime. Every time they took talent, ECW made new talent. They just ran out of. That's it. It's just okay. We're gonna take this guy. Well, we're gonna make new guys. You're gonna take him. We'll make Steve Corino champion. You're gonna take him. We'll make Mike Awesome champion. You're gonna take him. I guess we're out. You take the Dudley Boys, you know.
Well, so what happened was they didn't pull the trigger on RVD they waited too long for that.
Right.
They were building it, and it would have been great when they finally did it, but just ran out of time.
Well, when they were going to do it, he broke his ankle.
That hurt.
But they were still planning on doing it at the pay-per-view, the last pay-per-view that had planned and never happened. So they were still putting it off even then. However, we mentioned the TV. Now, a lot of promotions are of the mindset that we need to get TV because that's the next step. ECW might have been doing that because, well, our big deal is we're on pay-per-view now, and now we're going to compete. We're firing shots at WWF and WCW. So it was not hindsight, but was it a mistake to get TV?
I don't think so. Basically, the wrestling audience was huge at the time. They figured that they could take a little bit of the wrestling audience from WCW, from WWF, and create their own audience from those niches as well with their ECW diehards. Fact of the matter is, nobody knew ECW was on TNN.
Well, it wasn't
Except for
promoted
the
a lot.
diehards.
Right, it wasn't promoted a lot, and even so, when they weren't really getting support from the network, they still were doing decent ratings for ECW. And a lot of people who weren't in the Northeast like we were seeing ECW for the first time. So unlike this last year with Steve Corino, Jerry Lynn, those sort of guys leftovers, people were saying, well, I just saw ECW for the first time when they were on TNN, and I saw Super Crazy and Tajiri and a lot of these new acts, and they were into it. So what do you think the balance is there? Was TV a mistake because they exposed themselves to new people, or was it just too much of a cost in the end?
To tell you the truth, I think it was just the wrong network. I don't think TV was the problem at all. Yes, it sucks that all the best guys were leaving, but I thought it was just the wrong network. One thing I never got was, when WWF left USA to go to TNN, why didn't ECW try to get on USA? I mean, I know it's not that easy to do it,
right.
But USA had the block of time ready to go. It may not have been the best time to go back on Monday night or anything with ECW. We've been competing, but I'm sure they could have given them a time slot. I mean, USA already proved that wrestling works for them. Why not go after that?
Well, since ECW went bankrupt and got absorbed into the WWE universe, I suppose let's call it, it's been portrayed not just in revivals, in documentaries, etc., and in the fans' minds, a lot more positively than WCW. Was it because they went out better than WCW did? Or was it just because WWF was secretly funding them for all those years?
They did. They had the Vince McMahon machine behind them. You had Jerry Lawler coming in, you had Jim Cornette coming in, so you had that cross promotion. I'm watching Raw, and then you have the ECW guys coming in and attacking them. You didn't have Sting coming on Raw, jumping off the Raw banner. It's like, I don't care what Sting is. He's not cool enough to do that.
But WWF alone has done 3 ECW invasions at various points, but not one WCW one. Why wouldn't that be?
ECW faithful. You never heard the term WCW faithful. ECW, they had their cult
We just
following.
talked about it on the last show, but I see what you mean.
You have that underground following of just diehard fans. If you look at the old ECW matches, you look out in the audience, you see the same people there week after week after week. ECW was their show. It was their product. WCW was Ted Turner's and Eric Bischoff's. ECW's was the fans. They missed it because they were interacting with the show. They brought weapons to smash over Raven's head. It was theirs. They felt a sense of ownership and they missed it.
The fans got themselves over.
If they would have stayed without a TV network too, that they could have slowly built it a little more. They could have kept their costs down, build that fan following, start making money off DVDs, not just VHS like they were. DVDs started coming around. They could have made more money off of that. And they could have hit different territories within the United States, taken it overseas more. They could have definitely grown the product over time.
And stayed the underdogs.
Exactly.
But another reason why it's still beloved to this day is look how many champions came out of ECW. You got Mick Foley, one of the most beloved wrestlers of all time. He got his, like, I mean, not his big break, but he got a huge following in ECW that's led to his becoming Mankind. And less, you know, went on. You got the Dudley Boys, one of the greatest tag teams of all time. They ruled ECW for a short period of time, especially like '98. They were the hottest, like, heels in wrestling, maybe. And you got like Benoit, you got Guerrero. Those guys had their starts in American starts in ECW, and they got their jobs in WCW before that. There was more, but those are the big names I could think of.
That could be another reason why ECW is portrayed in such a positive light, because of those wrestlers. When they got screwed over by WCW, where did they go? They went to ECW and they vented about it. After they're done with ECW, that's when WWF picked them up and made them a superstar. So it was, you got fucked over by WCW, you went and you reinvented yourself in ECW as a hardcore badass, and then you went to the Attitude Era and made your money.
The Monday Night Wars, ECW was part of this, wrestling was hot, maybe it'll never be recreated and it wouldn't have happened in any other time frame, I don't know.
In 10 years when John Cena's fans are 18, maybe it'll be back again.
Well, I was going to ask, much like the WCW question of what their legacy is, but we ran out of time, sorry, it's gonna have to be on the radio show, so call in and share your thoughts, 347-857-4647, and we will continue to talk of the 10th anniversary of WCW and ECW's deaths. However, WCW and ECW dying led to the invasion angle that we talked about last week. We're going to talk about it some more, but with a twist. Rebooking the invasion when we come back.